Doctor swapped the black baby at birth. And years later, he became the white family's only heir. The DNA test results trembled in Dr. Eleanor Hartwell's weathered hands as she sat in her home office at 2:17 a.m. surrounded by medical journals and family photographs that suddenly felt like evidence of a lie she'd been living for 32 years. The laboratory letterhead bore results that would shatter two families' understanding of identity, heritage, and love. Probability of paternity, 99.97%. Marcus Thompson is the biological son of Jonathan and Eleanor Hartwell. The manila envelope had arrived 3 days earlier, but Eleanor had been unable to summon the courage to open it until tonight, when insomnia and guilt had finally overcome her desperate hope that her suspicions were wrong. At 68, she had spent 4 decades delivering babies, guiding families through the miracle of birth, and maintaining meticulous records that testified to her professional competence and ethical standards. Her office walls displayed certificates of excellence, letters of gratitude from grateful families, and photographs from retirement parties of colleagues who respected her as one of the most skilled obstetricians in Chicago's medical community. But the document in her hands revealed a secret that had been buried in the chaos of a particularly difficult night shift in August 1991, when exhaustion, understaffing, and a series of medical emergencies had created conditions for a mistake that would reshape multiple destinies across 3 decades. The weight of that knowledge felt heavier than any burden she'd carried during her medical career, including the losses that were inevitable in her profession and the ethical dilemmas that came with making life-and-death decisions in emergency situations. The memory came flooding back with devastating clarity. August 15, 1991, St. Mary's Hospital. 3 babies born within an hour of each other during a severe thunderstorm that had knocked out backup power systems and left the maternity ward operating under emergency protocols that prioritized immediate medical care over administrative procedures. Eleanor had been covering for 2 other doctors who'd been called away to handle trauma cases from weather-related accidents, leaving her to manage multiple deliveries simultaneously, while nurses juggled record-keeping that normally followed strict verification procedures designed to prevent exactly the kind of mistake that had apparently occurred. The storm had been unprecedented in its intensity, with winds exceeding 70 miles per hour and lightning strikes that had overwhelmed the city's electrical infrastructure. St. Mary's Hospital had been operating on emergency generators for over 4 hours when the maternity ward crisis had begun, with 3 women in active labor arriving almost simultaneously, just as the hospital's communication systems were failing and standard protocols were being abandoned in favor of immediate medical intervention. Marcus Thompson, now 32 years old, had grown up as the beloved son of James and Patricia Thompson, a working-class black family, who'd provided him with love, values, and opportunities despite financial limitations that made every achievement require extraordinary effort and sacrifice. James worked as a mechanic at a neighborhood garage, his hands permanently stained with grease, but his mind sharp with mechanical intuition that he'd passed on to his son in the form of logical thinking and problem-solving abilities. Patricia managed the front desk at a community health clinic, her warmth and organizational skills making her indispensable to both patients and medical staff, who relied on her ability to navigate bureaucratic complexities with grace and efficiency. Marcus had excelled academically from his earliest years, displaying mathematical abilities that amazed his teachers and parents, who'd never shown particular aptitude for abstract thinking. His elementary school teachers had recommended advanced placement programs that the Thompson family couldn't afford, leading Patricia to work double shifts to pay for supplemental education that would allow Marcus to develop his obvious intellectual gifts. By middle school, he was tutoring high school students in calculus. By high school, he was taking college-level courses through a scholarship program that recognized exceptional talent regardless of family income. His full scholarship to Northwestern University had been the culmination of years of academic excellence, community service, and personal essays that demonstrated both intellectual capacity and character development that impressed admissions committees who understood they were identifying future leaders. Marcus had graduated summa cum laude, with a degree in computer science, immediately recruited by tech companies that recognized his innovative thinking and collaborative leadership style. At 32, he was a senior software engineer at a major technology firm, earning a comfortable salary that finally allowed him to provide his parents with some of the security they'd sacrificed to ensure his success. What Marcus didn't know, what no one had suspected until a routine genetic screening required for his own newborn daughter had revealed impossible results, was that his biological parents were Jonathan and Eleanor Hartwell, the wealthy white couple who'd lost their newborn son the same night Marcus was born. Jonathan Hartwell had been a prominent real estate developer whose projects had shaped Chicago's skyline for 3 decades before his death, 18 months earlier, from a sudden heart attack that had shocked everyone who knew his apparently robust health and active lifestyle. His company, Hartwell Development Group, had built some of the city's most prestigious commercial and residential properties, creating wealth that had positioned the family among Chicago's social and economic elite. Jonathan had been known for his innovative approaches to urban planning, his commitment to sustainable construction practices, and his philanthropic activities that supported educational initiatives and community development programs. Eleanor Hartwell had built her own distinguished career in medicine, specializing in obstetrics and gynecology, while maintaining active involvement in medical research and teaching responsibilities at Northwestern University's medical school. Their marriage had been both personally fulfilling and professionally complementary, with Jonathan's business acumen and Eleanor's medical expertise creating a partnership that had benefited both their careers and their community involvement. They had planned to have several children, but complications during Eleanor's pregnancy had required emergency procedures that left her unable to conceive again, making their expected son even more precious to both parents. The Hartwells had raised David Thompson, believing him to be their biological child, never questioning the racial ambiguity that could be explained by distant ancestry or genetic variation that occasionally produced unexpected physical characteristics. David's darker complexion and different facial features had been accepted as evidence of recessive genes or ancestral heritage that might not have been fully documented in family genealogies that rarely traced lineage beyond a few generations. David had grown up with every privilege that wealth could provide: private schools that cost more than many families' annual incomes, international travel that broadened his cultural perspectives, Ivy League education that opened doors to elite professional networks, and trust funds that ensured financial security regardless of personal achievement or career choices. His childhood had been filled with opportunities that money could purchase: private tutoring, summer camps in exotic locations, cultural events that exposed him to art, music, and literature from around the world. But David had also grown up feeling fundamentally disconnected from parents who loved him, but never quite understood his interests, his personality, or his approach to life that seemed to emerge from somewhere beyond their family's cultural and social expectations. Where Jonathan and Eleanor valued academic achievement and professional success, David was drawn to artistic expression and social justice activism. Where his parents moved comfortably in wealthy social circles, David felt more authentic when working with community organizations that served people who struggled with poverty and systemic inequality. The disconnect had created emotional distance that money couldn't bridge and privilege couldn't heal. David's adolescence had been marked by conflicts over his choices of friends, activities, and values that seemed to challenge everything his parents considered important. His decision to study sociology rather than business or medicine had disappointed Jonathan, who'd hoped his son would either join the family company or pursue a prestigious professional career that would maintain their social status. David's romantic relationships had been another source of family tension. His parents had expected him to marry someone from their social circle, but David had consistently chosen partners who shared his commitment to social justice rather than his access to wealth. His long-term relationship with Michael Chen, a public interest lawyer who worked with immigrant families, had been accepted by Jonathan and Eleanor, but never fully embraced as the kind of partnership they'd envisioned for their son. Dr. Eleanor Hartwell's investigation into that night 32 years ago had required accessing archived hospital records that had been stored in basement files rarely consulted after the transition to electronic record-keeping systems. She'd spent weeks reviewing documentation, interviewing retired staff members who remembered the chaos of that storm, and piecing together a sequence of events that revealed how human error could alter destinies with consequences that rippled across generations. The storm had knocked out the hospital's main power grid at 11:47 p.m., just as Eleanor was delivering her third baby of the evening. Emergency generators had restored essential lighting and life support systems, but the electronic record-keeping systems remained offline for 43 minutes, long enough for handwritten tags and manual documentation to become confused in the controlled chaos of maintaining medical care during infrastructure failure. The hospital's backup protocols had been designed for shorter power outages, not the extended emergency conditions that had persisted throughout that night. Nurse Margaret Collins, now retired, but still haunted by that night, had confirmed Eleanor's worst fears during a phone conversation that felt like confession 32 years delayed. Dr. Hartwell. I've thought about that night so many times over the years. Margaret had said, her voice carrying guilt that had never fully healed. We had 3 babies born so close together, and with the power out, we were using temporary identification until the systems came back online. I think we mixed up the tags during the transfer to the nursery, but by morning everything seemed normal, and we never thought to double-check the documentation. Margaret's memories of that night were fragmentary, but consistent with Eleanor's own recollections of chaos that had made careful record-keeping nearly impossible. The emergency lighting had created shadows that made reading handwritten tags difficult. The usual verification procedures had been abbreviated due to urgent medical needs that took precedence over administrative protocols. Most significantly, the electronic systems that would normally have caught discrepancies had been offline during the critical period when infant identification was being established. The revelation explained inconsistencies that had never been investigated because they'd seemed minor at the time, blood type discrepancies that had been attributed to rare genetic factors, facial features that didn't quite match either set of parents, perfectly personality traits and talents that seemed to emerge from nowhere in family trees that showed no similar inclinations. What had appeared to be normal family variation had actually been evidence of switched identities that had shaped 2 families' lives for over 3 decades. Marcus's exceptional mathematical abilities had always puzzled James and Patricia Thompson, who were intelligent people, but had never shown particular aptitude for the kind of abstract thinking that had made their son a standout student in advanced calculus and computer science. They'd attributed his talents to genetic gifts that occasionally skipped generations or emerged from unknown ancestors, never suspecting that Marcus's abilities might have biological explanations they couldn't access through their family history. Similarly, David's artistic sensibilities and social justice passions had seemed disconnected from the Hartwells' business-focused, politically conservative family culture that emphasized achievement, financial success, and social status over creative expression or activism. Eleanor and Jonathan had supported David's interests while hoping he would eventually embrace family values and career expectations that seemed more appropriate to their social position and economic circumstances. The DNA testing that had revealed the truth had been routine medical screening required when Marcus's wife Sarah had given birth to their daughter Emma 6 months earlier. The genetic testing was designed to rule out hereditary conditions and provide medical history information that could guide Emma's future healthcare needs. The process required detailed family medical histories from both parents, leading to genetic analysis that would identify potential health risks and inform pediatric care decisions. When the initial results had shown impossible genetic relationships between Marcus and his supposed biological parents, the laboratory had requested additional testing to confirm their findings. The second round of tests had been even more precise, using advanced DNA analysis that could identify specific genetic markers with extraordinary accuracy. The results had been unambiguous. Marcus Thompson could not possibly be the biological child of James and Patricia Thompson, despite 32 years of family relationships built on that assumption. The discovery had sent Marcus to genealogy websites and DNA databases, seeking answers that might explain the impossible test results. The initial searches had been confusing, connecting him to genetic relatives he'd never heard of, while failing to show expected connections to the Thompson family tree. But the persistence that had made him successful in his technical career had eventually led to matches with other families whose DNA suggested biological relationships that seemed impossible given the family histories everyone thought they knew. The breakthrough had come when Marcus's DNA profile had matched with David Thompson in a genealogy database, showing genetic similarity that suggested sibling relationships despite their different family backgrounds and racial identities. The match had been so precise that genealogy algorithms had flagged it as a potential full sibling connection, prompting both men to investigate further the impossible genetic links that seemed to contradict everything they understood about their family origins. Dr. Hartwell's decision to reveal the truth to both families represented the most difficult ethical choice of her medical career. The mistake had been inadvertent, occurring during emergency conditions that had compromised normal safety protocols, but the consequences had been profound for everyone involved. The revelation would inevitably cause pain for people who'd built their identities around relationships that were biologically false, but emotionally authentic, disrupting family dynamics that had been stable and loving for over 3 decades. But the truth had legal implications that extended beyond family dynamics and personal relationships. Jonathan Hartwell had died 18 months earlier, leaving an estate worth over $50 million to his only son, David, who was legally entitled to inheritance based on 32 years of acknowledged paternity and legal documentation that established him as Jonathan's heir. However, the biological reality meant that Marcus was the legitimate genetic heir to wealth he'd never known existed, while David's inheritance rights were based on a medical mistake rather than actual birthright. The estate included not just financial assets, but also controlling interest in Hartwell Development Group real estate properties throughout Chicago art collections that had been assembled over decades, and trust funds that had been established to provide for future generations of the Hartwell family. The total value of the inheritance represented generational wealth that could transform not just Marcus's life, but also his daughter Emma's future opportunities and the financial security of the Thompson family who'd sacrificed so much to support his education and development. Eleanor Hartwell spent weeks consulting with attorneys, ethicists, and medical professionals about the best way to handle revelation of information that would reshape multiple families' understanding of their relationships and legal rights. The legal precedents for similar cases were limited, offering little guidance for situations where inadvertent baby swaps were discovered decades later with significant financial implications for all parties involved. The meeting Dr. Hartwell arranged with both families took place in a private conference room at Northwestern University Medical Center, a neutral location that felt both appropriate and haunting for conversations that would redefine everyone's understanding of identity, belonging, and family structure. She'd chosen the venue carefully, wanting space that felt professional and private while providing access to counseling services and legal consultation if the emotional impact of the revelation required additional support for families who would be processing life-changing information. Marcus arrived with his wife Sarah and their 6-month-old daughter Emma, his face reflecting confusion and anxiety about revelations that seemed too extraordinary to be real. He'd grown up hearing stories about his birth at St. Mary's Hospital, celebrating August 15th as the day he'd joined the Thompson family, never suspecting that those cherished memories were built on medical error rather than biological fact. Sarah carried Emma with the protective instincts of a new mother who sensed that whatever they were about to learn would have implications for their daughter's future and family identity. James and Patricia Thompson accompanied their son with dignity that reflected 32 years of unconditional love, while simultaneously processing grief about potentially losing biological connection to the child they'd raised with devotion and sacrifice. Patricia's eyes showed the strain of weeks spent wondering what the mysterious DNA results might mean for their family, while James maintained the quiet strength that had sustained them through decades of financial struggle and social challenges that came with raising an obviously gifted child in circumstances that made accessing opportunities difficult. David attended the meeting with his longtime partner Michael Chen, both men processing emotions that ranged from shock to grief to anger about deceptions that had shaped their entire lives without their knowledge or consent. David had always felt like an outsider in his family's social circle, but he'd never imagined that feeling had biological rather than just cultural explanations. Michael's presence provided emotional support, while also representing the legal expertise that might be necessary if the revelation had complicated implications for David's inheritance rights and future security. Eleanor and Robert Hartwell, David's adoptive grandparents who'd never questioned their grandson's appearance or personality differences, attended with confusion about why they'd been asked to participate in what had been described as an important family meeting. At 86 and 84 years old, respectively, they represented the generation that had welcomed David into the family without hesitation, providing grandparent love that had been uncomplicated by the questions that were now emerging about his biological origins. Eleanor Hartwell occupied the position of confessor and facilitator, bearing responsibility for the mistake that had created the impossible situation they were all navigating. Her explanation of that night's events was precise, clinical, and devastating in its implications for everyone present. She'd prepared detailed documentation, including hospital records, witness statements from retired staff members, and genetic analysis that confirmed the swap with scientific certainty that left no room for doubt or denial. 32 years ago, on the night of August 15, 1991, a severe thunderstorm created emergency conditions at St. Mary's Hospital that compromised our normal identification and record-keeping procedures. Eleanor began, her voice carrying the weight of decades in medicine and the specific burden of this particular error. 3 babies were born within an hour of each other during a power outage that lasted for 43 minutes. During that time, manual identification procedures were used, and I believe those procedures resulted in 2 infants being inadvertently switched. She paused, allowing the magnitude of her words to settle before continuing with information that would reshape everyone's understanding of their family relationships and legal status. Marcus, you are biologically the son of Jonathan and Eleanor Hartwell. David, your biological parents, are James and Patricia Thompson. The mistake occurred during a power outage when manual identification procedures were compromised by emergency conditions that prioritized immediate medical care over administrative verification. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by infant Emma's babbling as she played with toys in Sarah's lap, oblivious to conversations that were reshaping her family's understanding of their place in the world. The adults in the room sat motionless, processing information that challenged everything they thought they knew about identity inheritance and family connections that had seemed permanent and unquestionable. Marcus spoke first, his voice steady, despite the emotional earthquake he was experiencing. I need everyone to understand something clearly. James and Patricia Thompson are my parents. They raised me, loved me, sacrificed for me, and shaped every value I hold dear. DNA doesn't change that relationship or diminish my gratitude for everything they've given me throughout my life. His statement reflected the maturity and moral grounding that the Thompsons had instilled through their parenting, even as it acknowledged the biological reality that would have legal and financial implications regardless of emotional preferences or family loyalties. Marcus's engineering background had taught him to address problems systematically, focusing on facts while considering the human impact of potential solutions. Patricia Thompson wiped away tears that had been building since Eleanor's revelation, her voice breaking as she spoke. Marcus will always be our son, no matter what any test says. We've loved him for 32 years, and that love doesn't change because of a mistake that happened when he was a baby. But we also want what's best for him, even if that means acknowledging relationships we didn't know existed. Her response demonstrated the selfless love that had characterized her parenting throughout Marcus's childhood and adolescence, prioritizing his well-being over their own emotional needs, while processing grief about the loss of biological connection they'd never questioned until this moment. James Thompson's reaction was more reserved but equally profound. This explains some things I never understood. He admitted his honesty, revealing observations he'd made but never voiced about Marcus's abilities and interests that seemed to emerge from sources beyond their family's genetic heritage. But it doesn't change anything about how proud we are of the man he's become, or how grateful we are to have been his parents all these years. David's response was more complex, reflecting years of feeling disconnected from parents who'd provided material advantages, but never quite understood his personality values or life choices. I've always felt like I was living someone else's life, he said, his voice carrying both relief and sadness about finally understanding feelings he'd carried throughout his childhood and adult years. Learning about this mistake doesn't diminish my appreciation for the opportunities I've had, but it explains feelings I've carried my whole life about not quite fitting where I was supposed to belong. His honesty opened space for conversations about identity belonging and the complex relationship between biology and family bonds that transcended genetic connections. David had grown up with access to the best educational opportunities, international travel, and cultural experiences that wealth could provide, but he'd never felt fully connected to the family culture and social expectations that came with those privileges. Eleanor Hartwell, Marcus's biological mother, spoke with difficulty about emotions she was experiencing for the first time. Marcus, I lost my son 32 years ago or so, I thought. Learning that you've been alive and thriving all this time brings me joy I never expected to feel again. But I also recognize that you have parents who deserve credit for raising an exceptional young man, and I don't want to disrupt relationships that have been built on love and sacrifice. Her words reflected the complexity of their situation, where biological connections had to be balanced against emotional relationships that had been authentic and meaningful, despite being based on incorrect information. Eleanor had grieved the loss of her son for 3 decades, never knowing that Marcus was alive and being raised by people who loved him as much as she would have if she'd had the opportunity. The legal implications of the revelation were staggering in their complexity and far-reaching consequences for everyone involved. Marcus was entitled to inherit the Hartwell estate based on biological paternity that could be proven through DNA analysis, but claiming that inheritance would effectively disinherit David, who'd been raised as the heir and had built his life around expectations of financial security that would disappear if legal paternity were corrected through court proceedings. Margaret Santos, The Hartwell family attorney who'd been managing Jonathan's estate since his death had spent weeks researching precedent for similar cases and had found limited legal guidance for situations where inadvertent baby swaps were discovered decades later with significant financial implications. The law generally favored biological relationships for inheritance purposes, but 32 years of acknowledged paternity created equity claims that complicated straightforward genetic determinations. The estate law is clear about biological inheritance rights, Margaret explained during the legal consultation that felt more like family therapy than traditional attorney-client meeting. However, David's position as acknowledged heir for 32 years creates legitimate claims based on detrimental reliance and quantum meruit principles that courts would need to consider if this matter proceeded to litigation. She outlined scenarios that ranged from complete inheritance transfer to Marcus, based on biological paternity, to equal division between both young men based on equitable principles, to maintaining David's inheritance, while providing separate compensation for Marcus through other legal mechanisms. Each option carried advantages and disadvantages for all parties with potential for family conflict that could destroy relationships regardless of how financial assets were ultimately distributed. But the most significant aspect of their situation transcended legal technicalities to address fundamental questions about identity, family, and what constituted authentic relationships in circumstances where biology and love had been separated by medical error that no one had intended or discovered for over 3 decades. The emotional processing required weeks of family meetings, individual counseling sessions, and careful consideration of options that would honor both biological relationships and adoptive bonds while addressing legal realities that couldn't be ignored regardless of personal preferences. Both families needed time to adjust their understanding of relationships that had seemed permanent and unquestionable, while considering how revelation of the truth would affect future interactions and family dynamics. Marcus struggled with conflicting loyalties between the parents who'd raised him and the biological family he was just discovering, while also considering implications for his daughter Emma, who would inherit whatever decisions were made about family relationships and financial assets. His relationship with Sarah provided stability during emotional turbulence, but even their marriage was affected by questions about identity and family connections that would influence their child's future opportunities and cultural heritage. David experienced a complex mix of relief about finally understanding his lifelong sense of disconnection from the Hartwell family culture, along with grief about potentially losing financial security that had always seemed guaranteed regardless of his career choices or personal decisions. His relationship with Michael provided emotional support, while also raising questions about how their future plans would be affected by changes in David's inheritance status and family relationships. Eleanor Hartwell. The surviving biological parent surprised everyone by proposing a solution that honored both relationships while acknowledging the complexity of their situation and the legitimate claims that both young men had to family identity and financial security. Her proposal reflected months of consideration about justice, fairness, and family responsibility that extended beyond traditional legal definitions or social expectations. "I want to modify Jonathan's will to divide the estate equally between both boys," she announced during a family meeting that included legal counsel and emotional support professionals, her decision reflecting careful consideration of everyone's needs and rights in their unprecedented situation. "This feels like the right thing to do both legally and morally given the extraordinary circumstances that created this situation." Her proposal addressed the biological reality that made Marcus the legitimate heir, while respecting the emotional reality that David had been raised as Jonathan's son and deserved continued access to family wealth that had shaped his expectations and life planning. The equal division would provide both young men with substantial inheritances while avoiding court battles that could destroy family relationships regardless of legal outcomes. "Marcus, you are my biological son, and you're entitled to inherit your father's legacy." Eleanor continued, her voice carrying maternal warmth that had been absent from Marcus's life, but felt natural despite their recent connection. "But David, you were raised as our child, and Jonathan loved you as his son regardless of genetics. You both deserve to benefit from the family wealth that shaped one of your lives and should have shaped the other." The proposal created a framework for sharing inheritance while respecting the emotional reality that both young men had legitimate claims to family identity and financial security. But it also opened conversations about ongoing relationships and how two families could integrate their lives around children who'd been accidentally exchanged but authentically loved by everyone who'd been involved in their upbringing. Marcus's response to the inheritance proposal reflected the values his adoptive parents had instilled throughout his childhood and adolescence. "I don't want money that rightfully belongs to David, but I'm grateful for the opportunity to know my biological family and understand my medical history for Emma's sake. If Mrs. Hartwell wants to share the inheritance, I'd like to use my portion to establish educational programs that help other families access opportunities like the ones the Thompsons provided for me." His reaction demonstrated both gratitude for unexpected financial resources and commitment to using wealth responsibly in ways that honored the sacrifice his adoptive parents had made to ensure his success. Marcus understood that his achievements had been possible because James and Patricia had prioritized his education over their own financial security, working extra jobs, and forgoing personal luxuries to pay for supplemental programs that had developed his academic potential. David's reply revealed character development that had occurred despite growing up with privilege. "I want to share the inheritance because it feels right morally, but more than that, I want to know the family I was supposed to grow up with and understand what my life might have been if the mistake hadn't happened. I also want to use my resources to support causes that address the kind of systemic inequalities that made Marcus's achievements so much more difficult than they should have been." His response showed how learning about the swap had provided context for his lifelong interest in social justice issues and his discomfort with inherited privilege that he'd never felt he'd earned through personal merit or achievement. The relationships that developed over the following months challenged traditional definitions of family, while demonstrating how love could expand rather than divide when people approached complex situations with generosity, openness, and commitment to everyone's well-being, rather than protecting narrow self-interest or maintaining comfortable assumptions about identity and belonging. Marcus began spending regular time with Eleanor Hartwell, learning about his biological father's interests and personality, understanding genetic traits that explained his mathematical abilities and problem-solving approaches, and providing her with the grandparent relationship with Emma that she'd thought she'd lost forever when Jonathan died. Their connection developed naturally, despite the decades of separation built on genuine affection and shared interests rather than obligation or guilt about lost time. Eleanor shared stories about Jonathan's innovative approaches to construction and urban planning, explaining genetic heritage that had influenced Marcus's engineering career in ways he'd never understood. She provided family medical history that would be crucial for Emma's future healthcare, while also offering emotional connection to biological roots that Marcus had always wondered about but never been able to explore. David began traveling regularly to visit the Thompson family, discovering cultural experiences and community perspectives that wealth had never provided, developing relationships with biological parents and siblings he'd never known existed, and finding acceptance that felt more authentic than anything his privileged upbringing had offered. The Thompson family welcomed him with the same warmth they'd always shown Marcus, treating David as another son, rather than a stranger who happened to share their genetics. James Thompson taught David mechanical skills that connected him to practical problem-solving approaches he'd never learned, despite expensive educational opportunities. Patricia shared stories about community activism and social service that had shaped their family values, providing context for David's instinctive commitment to social justice issues that had seemed disconnected from his privileged background. The integration process wasn't without challenges and emotional difficulties that required ongoing counseling support and careful navigation of complex feelings about identity, loyalty, and family relationships. Both young men experienced periods of confusion about their sense of belonging, while all four parents had to adjust their understanding of relationships they'd thought were permanent and biological connections they'd never questioned. Marcus sometimes felt guilty about developing affection for Eleanor while maintaining primary loyalty to James and Patricia, struggling with questions about whether loving his biological mother represented betrayal of the people who'd actually raised him. Similarly, David worried that his growing connection to the Thompson family might seem like rejection of Jonathan and Eleanor's parenting, even though his relationship with them had always been complicated by cultural differences and conflicting values. The two families began celebrating holidays together, creating new traditions that honored both biological and adoptive relationships, while building bonds between extended family members who were learning to navigate unprecedented family structures. Emma's first Christmas was celebrated with 4 sets of grandparents, multiple aunts and uncles, and extended family connections that spanned racial and economic divides, while providing her with relationships that would enrich her understanding of diversity and belonging. The holiday celebrations became opportunities for cultural exchange that benefited everyone involved. The Thompson family introduced Eleanor to community traditions and cultural practices that broadened her understanding of experiences beyond her privileged background, while the Hartwell resources provided the Thompson family with access to cultural events and educational opportunities they'd never been able to afford. The inheritance division proceeded smoothly, once legal documentation was completed, with both young men using their resources to create opportunities for others who faced barriers similar to those Marcus had overcome, and privileges similar to those David wanted to share more responsibly and effectively. The financial security provided foundation for both families to pursue goals that had previously seemed impossible due to economic constraints or uncertainty about future resources. Marcus established scholarship programs for students from working-class families, focusing on providing not just tuition assistance, but also support services that addressed the additional challenges faced by first-generation college students who lacked family knowledge about navigating higher education systems. His programs included mentorship components, professional development opportunities, and financial literacy education that prepared students for long-term success, rather than just immediate educational access. David funded community development projects that addressed systemic inequalities in neighborhoods like the one where Marcus had grown up, supporting housing initiatives, small business development, and educational programs that created opportunities for economic mobility. His work focused on sustainable community improvement that empowered residents, rather than displacing them through gentrification that typically benefited wealthy developers at the expense of existing communities. The collaborative approach they developed to their philanthropic work demonstrated how their different backgrounds and perspectives could combine to create more effective solutions than either could have developed independently. Marcus's understanding of community needs and David's access to political networks allowed them to address problems at both grassroots and policy levels, creating systemic changes that went beyond individual charity to address underlying causes of inequality. Dr. Eleanor Hartwell's revelation of the 32-year-old mistake had legal consequences that extended beyond family dynamics to hospital policies, medical ethics review, and healthcare system improvements designed to prevent similar errors in the future. Her voluntary disclosure led to investigation of current identification procedures, implementation of technological safeguards against infant switching, and development of training protocols that prevented the kind of chaos that had enabled their situation. The hospital administration initially worried about liability issues and potential lawsuits related to the mistake, but the family's collaborative approach to resolution and their focus on positive outcomes rather than punitive measures allowed the institution to learn from the error without facing destructive legal battles that might have discouraged other healthcare providers from acknowledging similar mistakes or implementing necessary improvements. Eleanor's willingness to take personal responsibility for the error, despite the fact that it had occurred during emergency conditions that had compromised normal safety protocols, earned respect from medical ethics boards and professional organizations that recognized her integrity and commitment to patient welfare over personal reputation protection. But the most profound impact was personal. The creation of expanded family structures that proved love could transcend biology, while honoring the reality that genetics shaped identity in ways that couldn't be ignored or dismissed without consequences for medical care, family relationships, and personal understanding of heritage and belonging. Marcus remained Marcus Thompson in name and heart, maintaining his primary identification with the family who'd raised him while also embracing his biological heritage through legal name change to Marcus Thompson Hartwell that acknowledged both relationships without diminishing either. The dual identity reflected the complexity of his situation while providing Emma with access to extended family relationships and cultural heritage that enriched her understanding of identity and belonging. David chose similar dual identification that respected both his upbringing and his newly discovered roots, becoming David Hartwell Thompson in legal documents, while maintaining emotional connections to both families that had shaped his development in different but important ways. His choice reflected growing comfort with complexity, rather than simple categories, embracing multiple aspects of his identity, instead of feeling forced to choose between competing loyalties or family relationships. The legal and social recognition of their expanded family structure required navigating systems that weren't designed to accommodate their unusual situation, from updating insurance beneficiaries to explaining family relationships to schools, employers, and social institutions that expected traditional family categories. But their experience also contributed to broader social conversations about family diversity, identity complexity, and the need for systems that could accommodate different family structures without forcing people into categories that didn't reflect their actual relationships. The baby swap that had changed two families' destinies had ultimately created something unprecedented, an integrated extended family that spanned racial and economic divides while demonstrating that identity could be complex without being contradictory, that love could expand rather than divide when people approached relationships with generosity rather than scarcity, and that mistakes could sometimes create opportunities for growth and connection that might never have existed otherwise. Standing in the garden where both families gathered for Emma's first birthday party, 2 years after the revelation, watching Marcus and David collaborate on assembling playground equipment, while their parents shared recipes and stories, Dr. Eleanor Hartwell marveled at how her 32-year-old mistake had created relationships that enriched everyone involved rather than destroying family bonds as she'd feared when first discovering the truth. The White family's heir was indeed the black baby who'd been accidentally swapped at birth, but the inheritance he'd received transcended money to include expanded understanding of family identity and the power of love to create connections that biology alone could never have provided. The shocking hospital mistake had changed destinies forever, but the changes had ultimately benefited everyone willing to embrace complexity over simplicity, inclusion over division, and growth over protection of comfortable assumptions about identity and belonging. Emma Thompson Hartwell played happily among relatives who represented every aspect of her complex heritage, surrounded by adults who'd learned that family could be created through choice and commitment as powerfully as through genetics, and that the most meaningful inheritance wasn't financial wealth, but the capacity to love beyond traditional boundaries and to find opportunity for connection, even in circumstances that initially seemed like devastating loss. The doctor who'd made the mistake that changed everything watched 4 parents who'd become friends, 2 young men who'd become brothers despite growing up as strangers, and 1 toddler who would grow up understanding that family meant love, commitment, and choice rather than just shared DNA. The legacy of that stormy night in 1991 would continue through Emma's generation and beyond, proving that sometimes the most profound gifts come disguised as mistakes, and that the most beautiful families are created by people who choose to love beyond the boundaries that society typically uses to define who belongs together and who remains forever separate.